Welcome to our lecture on Immanuel Kant and his deontological ethics. Here is a picture of Kant. He is primarily an 18th century German philosopher. He grew up in Königsberg, which was a part of Prussia. At the time, Germany was a kingdom there, and Prussia is a part of that kingdom. And you can see when he was born and died. Many argue that he is one of, if not the most influential philosopher of the modern era. We talked a lot about David Hume already. Kant lived, their lives overlapped. Remember, Hume dies in 1776, so there was some influence on Kant by Hume, even though their ideas often were very much contrasted each other. But we have this quote here that Immanuel Kant credits Hume with awakening him from a, quote, dogmatic slumber. The word dogma are unquestionable rules. So a lot of people talk about religious dogma, rules that are not meant to be questioned. And that's exactly what a good philosopher will do, is question things that most people wouldn't. So that's quite a compliment that Kant is paying to Hume. He was kind of a homebody. He didn't travel much, wasn't particularly cosmopolitan, so didn't travel, as it says here, more than 100 miles from his hometown. He was very regimented in his daily life. He liked rituals, he liked routines. So if that's your type of personality, then you and Kant have something in common. There's a joke that Kant would always take a walk at the exact same time. So he was so regimented in it that you could set your watch or pocket watch by his daily walks. Key concepts for Kant's ethics include reason, intention, duty, and absolute/universal ethics. Reason is important because ethics is something we can figure out from reason alone. We don't need experience to do it. So there might be some overlap with what Plato might say, that the key to understanding truths in ethics are going to be something that we can figure out philosophically with our reasoning ability. Kant prizes intention over consequences, so we'll talk a little bit more about that and give an important example. Kant's ethics is sometimes described as duty-based ethics or deontological. We'll see that word in the first bullet point here. You can see it toward the end of the bullet point. The root there, dion, is ancient Greek for duty. So morality is a system of imperatives, a system of duties that we owe to each other and also to ourselves. And the rules that Kant comes up with, his ethical rule number 1 has this funny name, the categorical imperative. We'll talk about that a lot, and many consider it to be absolute and universal. So again, a kind of a recap of what I said. Should we look more at consequences of actions? When we look at the utilitarianism or the consequentialism of John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians and Jeremy Bentham, they will go to the other extreme and say intention has little to no worth when you evaluate moral behavior. Instead, we should look solely at the consequences. But for Kant, like I said, it's the opposite. We should look at what did one intend, what's their motive, what's their will. Deontology, the moral worth of one's conduct is based solely on their or her adherence to rules, your duties. Right at the beginning of the reading that you had for this section, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant says explicitly that the only thing that matters is one's intentions, not consequences. Nothing in the world, or out of it, exclamation point, can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification except a good will. So when he says will there, he's talking about what one intends to do. So if you intend to do something good but you fail, it doesn't matter. It's your intention. That's what counts. So that grade you would get when you were younger in elementary school, A for effort, That could be a slogan or one of the slogans for Kant's ethics. It's about what you intend or try to do, not so much the consequences, because that we have much less control over and would subject ethics or an ethical theory too much to arbitrariness or randomness. Kant also stresses reason over desire. Remember, for Hume, we see the rejection of moral realism, so he's an anti-realist, and we see the rejection of ethics tied to truth, belief, or reason. Instead, for Hume, we should look toward our emotions and our desires. But Kant takes the exact opposite tack and says here, an action's moral value doesn't depend on whether it's aimed, whether what is aimed at in it is actually achieved. So it doesn't matter if you accomplish your goal, it's on what you intended to do. He continues, but solely on the principle of the will, right, what you intend, from which the action is done. And in red here, irrespective of anything the faculty of desire may be aiming at. So for Hume, arguably the basis of morality is going to be desired, or at least a desire is going to be at center stage, and we're trying to figure out the basics of our moral philosophy. So that's the contrast with Hume. Whether or not we are moral does not depend on our desires, but Hume claims the opposite. So I represented that contrast here on the left here. You can see desire is pinned against reason. Again, it might not be quite right to completely separate desire from reason and emotions from reason, but for simplicity's sake, for argument's sake, we'll just do it to keep things straight in our mind. So you've got Hume connected with desire, Kant connected with reason, and underneath that we see in green, from which we derive the moral law, i.e. our moral duties. So we use reason to figure out what duties we owe to ourselves and to others, and we derive them a priori from the former, or which contrasts with a posteriori, which we will see later. A priori means literally from the former, or from before. Before what? Before experience. So reason we can use to figure some things out before we go out into the world and have experiences or test or verify something. A posteriori literally means from the latter, which or from the after what? After experience. So you remember those toys you would get as a kid, no experience necessary? Well, that's what a priori means, and if experience is required, that would be a posteriori. So since this moral law is derived from reason, we get these duties, and they are absolute and universal. They apply to everyone. They're exceptionless. When we talk about Mill and Bentham's consequentialism or utilitarianism, they stress consequences over intentions. Now, there's a benefit to going in that direction, but there are some problem cases. So, for instance, let's say that there was some wicked person who was really upset with the Pope of the Catholic Church and knew that the Pope was traveling to California, maybe near campus, and was going to climb a tall tower with a sniper rifle and try to take out the Pope, and sets everything up. The Pope comes, big crowd. The Pope is in that Pope-mobile wearing the big hat. The Pope-mobile has got bulletproof glass, but then for a moment the Pope steps outside of the Pope-mobile, and that's when our wicked person pulls the trigger on the sniper rifle and hits the Pope. Doesn't hit the Pope. Doesn't hit the Pope. Maybe the big hat is so distracting that he hits the hat, but that doesn't hit the Pope's head. It goes right through the Pope's hat, and the bullet hits the ground somewhere on our campus, and that all of a sudden, where the bullet hit, there's a little divot in the ground, and then there's a crack, and the crack grows, and this is so hard to believe, but that's what's fun about these hypotheticals. This black liquid starts oozing and seeping up from the ground, and on accident, this sniper has struck oil. Tried to kill the Pope, but instead has struck oil, scurries off so that they don't get caught, never seen from again. But now we've got oil shooting up from the ground on campus, and of course it's very valuable, so the campus can sell the oil, and we use the money so that everyone on campus gets free tuition, we get new buildings, we pay the faculty a great amount, all the books are free parking. So the intention was wicked, but the consequences were good. So if you're someone like Kant, you can still point at the sniper and say that when we evaluate their behavior, them as a person, we can say that they are morally wicked or morally bad because we judge them on the intention, which was bad. But if we look solely at the consequences and ignore the intention, then we have to applaud the sniper for doing something good because the consequences were not bad at all; they were positive. So we would have to say, in retrospect, that was a good thing. So that is a problem case, not for Kant, but for Mill and Bentham. Let's talk a little bit about reason and duty. So here are some quotes from the Metaphysics of Morals, the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. For an action to have genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. To have a duty is to be required to act in a certain way out of respect for the law. So we can reason out what's right and wrong, and it's imperative, it's our duty to follow those rules. It's a cognitive intellectual process, has nothing to do with what we want or what makes us happy or desire. Moral truths, then, are universally binding. They're knowable a priori. Remember, that's a Latin phrase that means from the former, or from before. Before what? Before experience. So you can reason them alone. Just like to complete proofs or theorems in math or logic or geometry, you don't need to do an experiment. You don't need experience. If you were a math and logic genius or a geometry genius, you could just close your eyes and you could just think about the premises, and you could derive or you could deduce the conclusions of the proofs. So morality for Kant is going to have this funny name, the categorical imperative. So to understand what's going on there, let's contrast general categorical imperatives with hypothetical imperatives. Well, the one on the left, hypothetical, is based on desire, and categorical imperatives are following rules that you should follow independent of desire. All imperatives, Kant says, are either hypothetical or categorical. The former, so that would be hypothetical, are practically necessary of some possible action as a means. So hypothetical imperatives represents means and reasoning. So you're following them to achieve something that you want. An imperative would be categorical if it represented an action as being objectively necessary in itself without regard to any end or desire. So the form of hypothetical imperatives is, if you want X, then do Y. If you want X, do Y. So they're based on X, your desire. So for instance, if you are motivated to be honest with your friends merely because you don't want to be alone on a Friday and Saturday night. So if you want to hang out with fun people on a Saturday night, then be friendly to them, then that would be following a rule of thumb based on a hypothetical imperative and shouldn't be your drive. So what you should be kind and honest with your friends, not because you get something out of it, not because it satisfies some desire, but just because it's in and of itself, it's the right thing to do. So the form of a hypothetical imperative again is, if you want X, then do Y. But for a categorical imperative, it would just be do X. It's not tied to any desire. It's an objective rule. So Hume and Philippa Foot, that's one of the readings for this course, they endorse hypothetical imperatives. They argue more or less that morality is a system of hypothetical imperatives, that what we want ultimately drives our actions, and thus even for moral behavior, it's going to be a part of our decision-making process. But for Kant, morality is a system that has nothing to do with desire. It's based on reason alone, a system of categorical imperatives. So here's the categorical imperative. The categorical part means universal. That's categorical in a sense is a synonym for universal. It's binding for all people, or what Kant called all rational agents. It's imperative because it's our duty to follow it. There's different versions or formulations of the categorical imperative. We'll look at several of them. Here's one. I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. Wow, that's a mouthful. We're going to have to parse that out. And here it is slightly revised. There's only one categorical imperative, and is this: act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. All imperatives of duty can be derived from this one imperative. You know, I was listening to the stand-up comedy on Netflix of a comedian named Louis C.K. A lot of you might be a fan of him. And he was talking about raising young children, and he has a couple daughters, and teaching them right from wrong. And at one point, he was talking to them about lying. And he tells them that they shouldn't lie. But the joke is, even though lying is, he's joking, he says lying is great because lying can get you out of anything. It can really get you whatever you want. So from a very selfish point, lying can be very beneficial, but we still know that it's morally wrong. And then Louis C.K. Steps back from that position, the joking position about lying is great, and it's so wonderful, and it fixes everything. That's the line, is it fixes everything. And he says, no, I think that we need to act in such a way such that if everyone acted that way, the world would work. So, for instance, cutting in line. That we know that's morally wrong, because if everyone cut in line, the whole line system would fall apart, right? Or take line. Maybe you could lie once and get away with it, but the reason why that's wrong, arguably, is that if everyone were, if it weren't just you getting the exception, if everyone were allowed to do that, then no one would be able to trust each other, and society would crumble pretty quickly. So that's the basic idea here behind this first formulation of the categorical imperative. But it takes a while to sink in. It's quite complicated, and if you're lost at this point, then you that's where most people would be, including myself, if I was learning this for the first time. So let's slow down and let's go through some more examples of this categorical imperative. So here I have the general what I call the categorical process. So you'll see we're going to start with some arrows here, but let's go back to the beginning. So the process always starts with something called a maxim. And a maxim, we're not talking about that men's magazine. We're talking about a little rule of thumb. So I'm look both ways before you cross the street. That's a maxim. Or little superstitions can be little maxims. So when I get important things in the mail, I will make sure to, if I'm on my phone, or when I was younger, when I got things in the paper mail, if it was something really important, like a potential college admissions letter, I would make sure to open it by myself, because somehow if somebody else was there, they might jinx it. So it always has this form: in circumstances X, I will do Y. So if I get an important letter, I will open it alone. If I'm walking across the street, then I will look both ways. So they're little linguistic rules of thumb, or the way that Kant actually defines it, a subjective principle of action. That's what a maxim is, a subjective principle of action. So it's a rule, but it's a personal rule. And so we'll take that personal rule, and then we will imagine that it's not a personal rule, that it's the universal rule. So when you think about the lying case, you might say, well, in this one case, I will lie, and it'll just be, that's my little code for myself only. But we know that if that's a personal rule, that's a maxim. But if we make that a universal rule, society won't function properly, and that's very problematic. So let's say our maxim is, and Kant talks about 4 examples, including this one about being lazy and breaking promises. In circumstances X, I will do Y. When I'm lazy, I will break my promises. Step 2 is to universalize the maxim. So instead of the I'm lazy and I will break promises, that's subjective, we imagine that it is universal. Whenever anyone or whenever someone in general is lazy, they will break their promises. So the rule isn't just followed by me, it's followed by everyone. So now what we do is we ask ourselves, in this scenario where everyone's breaking promises left and right when they're lazy, we ask, is there a contradiction in conception? And there will be a contradiction in conception when we imagine it would be difficult or impossible to act on our maxim, to do the Y part. And the Y part is break a promise. So what you're going to do is you're going to imagine a world where whenever anyone's lazy, they break their promises. So imagine that for a moment. So that's not our world, right? Luckily, lots of people keep their promises. But instead of thinking of this world, consider an imaginary world, a logically possible world, as it were, where nobody keeps their promises. Okay, so you got that? And now let that world play out a little bit. And now we are going to imagine being whisked away, being instantaneously transported to that world. We'll get plopped down in that world. And now what we are going to attempt to do is we are going to attempt the Y. We're going to attempt to act on the maxim. We are going to attempt to break a promise. Now, when we try to do that, do you imagine that it would be difficult or impossible to break a promise in that world? Well, if you think about it, the answer is yes. And if it's difficult or impossible to act on the maxim, then we hit a contradiction in conception. Now, why would it be difficult or impossible? Well, in a world where no one keeps promises, and then we enter into that world, and then we try to break a promise, it would be difficult or impossible. Because to break a promise, you need to make a promise, right? Think about that. To break a promise, you need to make a promise. Now, would we be able to make a promise to anyone in this world? Think about it. Probably not. Why? Well, when we go down and we say, "Hey, Joe Schmo, can I lend me $20? I promise I will pay you back." What is Joe Schmo's or Jane Schmo's or Maria Schmo's, whatever, what is their answer going to be? They're probably going to look at us and laugh and say, "I'm not going to trust you. Nobody's trustworthy in this world." So the promise won't happen in the first place. It won't be made, and hence it won't be broken. So it would be difficult or impossible. We hit a contradiction in conception, and thus we have what Kant calls a perfect duty, which means it's always impermissible, it's always morally wrong to act on that maxim. So it's always wrong to break promises, just because you're lazy. Let's try another example. Suppose my little rule of thumb is, when life is a bummer, when life sucks, I will just end it all. I'll commit suicide. So imagine if that's somebody's rule. Now imagine that it's everybody's rule. We'll universalize the maxim. So whenever someone's just kind of having a bad day, they just end it all. they just commit suicide. So we imagine that world, and we let things play out, and then we're transported to that world. Would it be difficult or impossible to act on the maxim? Would it be difficult or impossible for us to commit suicide, the second we're having a bad day in that world? In other words, is there a contradiction in conception? If you think about it, the answer is yes. To commit suicide, what's one of the prerequisites? Well, you have to be alive, right? Well, to be alive, you need to be born. But in this world, you probably wouldn't even be born. Why? Because your parents probably had a bad day before they got together and had you, and thus committed suicide before they had you, and hence you don't exist. And if you don't exist, how are you going to commit suicide? It would be difficult to commit suicide if you were never born. So we hit a contradiction in conception. It would be difficult to act on that maxim, and thus a perfect duty, always wrong, to commit suicide just when you're having a bad day. So you see, Kant has given us what's called a procedural principle. A procedural principle. It helps us figure out what to do when we have these ethical dilemmas. So in general, here's the categorical imperative procedure. We start with our subjective principle of action, or maxim. It's all about what I do in circumstances X, and then we universalize it. And then we see, are there any contradictions in conception? Would it be difficult or impossible to act on the maxim if we were transported into this world where the rule is being followed? Generally, if we say yes, there's a perfect duty, it's always wrong. But what if there is no contradiction in conception? We haven't looked at an example of that. We're going to look at two of them. Well, then we look for contradictions in will. So it's not so much difficult or impossible to act on the maxim. We could get away with, in the former cases, if we couldn't really do it. It would be tough. But if we could get away with the suicide or the breaking of the promise, then we would ask ourselves, is there a contradiction in will? In other words, is this a rule that that a rational person would endorse? Or to put it another way, is this possible world one that a rational person would select to live in? And if the answer is no, if it's not a rule that a rational person would endorse, we hit a contradiction of will. And that means that sometimes it might be okay, but certainly sometimes it's wrong. We get a duty that Kant calls imperfect. And if it passes both these parts of the test, if there's neither a contradiction in conception nor will, then acting on that maxim, performing that behavior, in other words, is morally permissible or acceptable. So let's look at a couple cases where we hit a contradiction in will, and then finally a case where we hit neither. So here's our maxim. If it's a hassle, I won't develop my talents. And if you did the reading, the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, you'll see Kant runs through all four of these examples. So whenever it's a hassle, I won't develop my talents. Well, it's pretty much always a hassle to develop your talents. Maybe sometimes you're feeling the flow of some sport or some maybe creative talent you have, but it's a lot of hard work. So a lot of times you don't want to do it, but you should if you want to improve. So we go from the subjective to the universal. So we universalize it, and it becomes, whenever it's a hassle for anyone, no one will develop their talents. Okay, so now we imagine a world where everyone, as Kant puts it, lets their talents rust. They're not working on their talents. And we let that play out. Now we're transported to this world, and we're going to try to be like everyone else and let our talents rust, to not work on them. Would that be difficult or impossible? So it's a world where, there's no professional athletes or creative people. Yeah, so society might be able to function, just might be a very boring world. So Kant doesn't see that there's a contradiction in conception. If you got transported to that world, you could not you could act on the maxim. You could let your talents rust whenever it is a hassle. So there's not a contradiction in conception, but is this a world that a rational person would endorse or select? So think of it this way: if you were to set up the rules of the world, would this be one of the rules that you pick? Would you choose to live in such a world? Put it that way. Now think about it. This is a world where there's no Michael Jordans, there's no Steph Currys, there's no Bachs or Beethovens, there's no Kanyes, there's no Madonnas or Beatles or Rolling Stones, there's no EDM. Whoever your favorite artist is, they wouldn't be around because all of them, there were times where they needed to practice and it was a hassle. No one is born. People are born with dispositions and kind of natural gifts, but everyone has to work on their talent. Even someone like Michael Jordan had to, if you watch his interviews, he had to practice. Same thing with people like Steph Curry. So it's not a world that a rational person would opt to live in. And so we hit a contradiction of will, which means that maybe not always. Maybe you could let some of your talents rust, but at some point it's got to be wrong. If you went your whole life and you didn't work hard on a talent, you would be acting outside the confines of morality. It makes me think of what parents say to their children sometimes, when they're in middle school. Parent says, hey, got you piano lessons, or we got you swim lessons. And then there's the kid, it's like, nah, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And then the parent might say, okay, fine. You don't have to do those things we talked about, but you got to do something. It's summer vacation. You can't just sit around and be lazy. You got to work on something. If it's not piano or swimming, then some other instrument or some other activity. And if you just did nothing, that would be no good. Okay, the fourth example where we hit contradiction of will but not of conception. It's about charity. When somebody needs help, which I can easily provide, I won't help the person. So, think about either when you're walking down the street and you see someone and they say, oh, can I have some change, or do you got $1 you could spare? Or think about at some of those retailers or like a grocery store where you're swiping your card, you're inserting the chip of your card, and it says, would you like to, in addition to paying for your goods, would you like to donate $1, $3, $5 to help? Now, are you required to give money in every single one of those circumstances? Most people will say no. That would be too onerous, too burdensome. But if you went your whole life and you never gave, then that would probably be wrong. So that means that we're not going to have a duty that's perfect. It's not always wrong to not help. It's just sometimes wrong to not help. So we're not going to get a contradiction of conception. We're going to get a contradiction of will. So imagine a world where whenever someone needs help, which they can easily provide, they won't help the person. So this would be a world where, you got the world would probably function, but people wouldn't be able to rely on getting help from people. We're not talking about like children when they need help. We're talking about autonomous adults. So it's a world where everyone, it's just socially, you do it on your own. Now, so would you be able to be like everyone else and not help? You probably could. It wouldn't be too difficult or impossible, so we don't get a contradiction in conception. But is that a world that you would select to live in? A world where no one helps each other? No, we wouldn't want to live in that world. So we hit a contradiction of will. Yes, we do hit a contradiction of will. So we have an imperfect duty. Sometimes it's wrong to not help, to not give. So those are Kant's 4 cases. The lying promise, the suicide case, the letting the talents rust, and then not the charity case, not helping people. In two of them, we had a perfect duty, and two of them, we had an imperfect duty. Well, does anything ever pass the categorical imperative? Well, sure. How about this? When I have some free time and I'm in the mood to play guitar, I will. So in circumstances X, I will do Y. The circumstances are I'm in the mood to play guitar, I have some free time, so I will go ahead and do that. So now we universalize the maxim. So whenever someone has free time and they're in the mood, they play guitar. So now imagine that people follow that rule. Now, in that world, would you be able to act on that maxim? Would you be able to play guitar when you're in the mood and have free time? Sure you would be able to. There wouldn't be any difficulty in that, so there's no contradiction in conception. What about a contradiction in will? Would you be okay with, would you choose a world to live in where one of the rules is when people have free time and they want to play guitar, they do? Sure. You would be fine with that rule. So it's not a rule that you would will against. So there's no contradiction in will. So does this mean that we're morally required to play the guitar when we're free time when we want to? No, it just means that it's morally permissible. It just means that it's morally okay, morally acceptable. So let's pause here since we've done a lot. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk more about Immanuel Kant's system of moral philosophy and the categorical imperative.